Hi, and welcome to this review of Brian Aldiss's Frankenstein Unbound, which I have just finished reading and I very much want to review before I move on to another book because there's a lot of moving parts to this book. There's a lot there. I'll start with the cover. I'm really enjoying the Pan Lozenge books at the moment. I've got a few of them, and with this particular one, the artwork is spectacular. Now, I did go on, it's not credited on the book. Pan doesn't seem to do that very often, but when I went online, a lot of people are suggesting that this is by Paul Bacon, ISFDB, which I recently discovered. Also credits it to him, but it uses the words attributes. So I don't know if that means they know it for sure, if they just think it. Anyhow, this artwork from 1973, I believe, at least, and so it was all drawn and painted by hand. A real artist did this, and I don't know that it shows up terribly well on the camera, but the shading is so subtle and so beautiful. I'm thinking watercolors. If you know, let me know. But the subtlety of the small things, like the line drawing to the hair and then the actual individual colors of the hair, beautiful. And it pops out more on the video, on the camera, than it actually does in real life. That, as well as the actual profile of Frankenstein's monster, the shading for his cheekbones and his hairline and stuff is actually a second portrait of a man in possibly a black suit and a pink tie. On the cover, you need to look at it for a while before you actually see that. Beautiful cover, well suited to the book. Okay, so this is going to be a hard book to give a star rating to. I don't think I'll have to on Goodreads, but honestly, I don't think a star rating belongs to this book because there's so many different things that you could rate, and each one of them in their own right could be rated. So we'll start with the beginning. In the beginning, what we've got is a post-apocalyptic scenario, but it's post-apocalyptic light because it doesn't really continue into the rest of the book. It's merely a justification for the rest of the book. We begin in the far, far future, the distant futuristic distant time of 2020. When this was written in 73, or copyrighted in 73 at least, man has been quarrying uranium for such a long time, which was a problem, which was a concern in the 70s, and has done so many explosions in the Earth-lunar vicinities that nature itself, in capital letters, has been disordered. As Brian Aldiss puts it, the infrastructure of time and space has been messed with. And that has led to these time slips. So a time slip is where a portion of here and now just goes elsewhere for hours or days, possibly forever. We don't ever really find out about that. And people and things go with it, and sometimes it comes back. So we start with the protagonist, who is on his home ranch, and with that background of the time slip is how the bulk of the novel happens. And part one starts with a letter from Joseph Baudelaire to his wife Mina. So if you don't like the style of letter writing, this book may not be for you. There's a special term for that. Epistolary framing, I think it is, because the letter is framing an event. I haven't always loved that style, but here I do. Here I think it's marvelous, because what it is it is very much a tribute to the books. That this whole book is essentially a tribute and a love letter, I guess I would say, to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but also probably to all those romance style books of the era. So Joseph Baudelaire's wife is Mina, and I'm going to guess that's a very open nod to Dracula, where the early letters are between Mina and her fiancé, but also definitely to Frankenstein, which starts off as letters between some random ship captain and his sister back in wherever he doesn't know she's ever going to get the letters. Incidentally, now is the time to point out that I do not like Mary Shelley's Modern Frankenstein or A Modern Prometheus. I do not like that book at all for a whole heap of different reasons. Now, since reading this book and making the original notes that I did about it, I found out a few things. Stephen over at the Outlaw Bookseller has done this video which is most overrated books, and one of the books that science fiction books, and one of the books that I proposed was Frankenstein. I think that's an incredibly overrated science fiction book for a whole number of reasons that we can't go into here because we don't have 5 hours. Anyhow, following a discussion on that, I've been told I need to read a different version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Maybe I will like it better after that. It's possible. Maybe. But more to the point, I also discovered that until this book came out in 1973, Aldiss was the one who first proposed Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a science fiction classic. Before that, it wasn't known for that. In this book, our protagonist, Joseph Baudelaire, a number of times refers to Frankenstein, and he refers it as a science fiction classic, as a forerunner of science fiction. He talks about a couple of things in it. I think he mentions the AI connection and a few other things, but basically it is really clear from the book that he desperately admired that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Mary Shelley. There's definitely a fanfic element here to Mary Shelley herself. But also this is the reason why you think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a science fiction book. That's for another review. Okay, so we start off with Joseph Baudelaire. He's on this ranch. He's writing to his wife Mina to come home because it's so dangerous out in the world due to the time slips and a whole heap of other things. Their children have actually been killed, and he is now minding their grandchildren. And there's a few little stories about life on the ranch. Eventually, a time slip happens in which the whole area outside the ranch vanishes. This new place appears, and Joseph, very unwisely in my opinion, and his grandchildren go out to explore it briefly and before coming home. That area stays for 24 hours. Now later, Joseph ventures on his own into another time slip just outside the ranch, but that doesn't last for as long. It only lasts for hours, and he's trapped in the time slip in the past. And that slingshots us into the different era. Now, I should not mention that right now. Sorry. I loved the era into which he's catapulted. He's catapulted into Switzerland, a country I visited last year and loved. So I thought backdrop was delightful. This Switzerland is in 1816, and Joe is wandering around the countryside forlornly. I think initially he hopes to go back to his own time, but then he just gives up and he's been to Switzerland before. He ends up in an inn where everyone's discussing not the world events that he thinks of when he thinks back to 1816, but a local trial that's happening to some woman called Justine Moritz. And the name rings a faint bell, but it doesn't really know why. Anyway, Joe sits down at a table with some mopey, unwelcoming, not nice human being and tries to strike up a conversation. Whereupon he discovers that this person is Baron Frankenstein. Now, Joe's a bit confused here. He has read Frankenstein and is pretty sure that Baron Frankenstein and the monster and the whole thing that Mary Shelley wrote about was a product of her imagination. But here he is, sitting in the pub, allegedly in the past, talking to Baron Frankenstein himself. And it transpires that the trial, the Justina Moritz trial, is actually for the woman who, in the Frankenstein story, gets accused of the murder that was committed by the monster. That sets up the novel, and I'm not going to spoiler specific events all that much in this review. But after going into Geneva and trying to remonstrate, I guess, with Frankenstein about what he's doing with his monster and his future, he ends up going up to the lake that summer where Mary Shelley Well, she wasn't Shelley there, as it tells us in the book. She was Mary Wollstonecraft, probably not pronouncing that correctly, and Percy Shelley, her lover, later to become her husband, and her sister, half-sister, and Lord Byron were all staying, and he becomes part of that small circle, and he has some good discussions, and he briefly gets together with Mary Shelley, which is where the fanfic elements comes in. I'm not going to say that bothered me. If it bothers you that someone who's a grandfather to two children that are out of their toddler years is having an affair with a girl who is 16, this book may not be for you. I feel that most people that read a lot of older books and classic science fiction can swim past that. And honestly, we're not even really sure if any of this is real. It might not be. He's not sure if it's real, and he increasingly says that. So there's a point on page 35 where our protagonist describes the novel by Mary Shelley and adds that most people don't know it very well, but rather they know the deplorable pastiches and plagiarizations that have happened since the novel was written. And I'm with Aldiss there. The novel is what it is, and I didn't used to be as annoyed by it back in the day. One of the things that annoys me about Frankenstein is how people go, oh, it's science fiction because of this and that and the other, but none of those things actually happen in the book. The book itself is what it is, but most people who think of Frankenstein are thinking of all the multiple plagiarizations and pastiches, as Aldiss would put it. So Aldiss respects the book, and he's the one that popularized it, which I think is great. Now, as for this book itself, I keep talking about the source book when I shouldn't. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Brian Aldiss, at his best, and at his worst probably, writes spectacularly lovely prose. And I love that about him. I don't think his narratives and his plots always make sense. And at times in this one, they don't too. So if you look on Goodreads, you'll find a lot of reviews. And even the nicest, kindest reviews who said they like it, say they didn't quite understand what was happening. And for a lot of this, the narrative does odd things. But that didn't bother me. The writing was beautiful. I really, really enjoyed the This is a small book, 157 pages, but it actually took me longer to read than Frankenstein itself did, which is a much thicker book, because it's just so beautiful. The actual narrative flows over you like a warm ocean, and I loved every second of the actual reading, even when I had no idea what point Aldiss was trying to make, and even when the choices of our protagonist, Joe, make no sense, which I've got to tell you, happens a lot. Still. One of the problems that I feel that Aldiss has with some of his work is a lack of characters and protagonists, but that is not the case here at all. You've got this Joseph Baudelaire, and I wonder if there's an element of Aldiss putting himself into that character a little bit. There's always some for an author, but I do wonder if Baudelaire is kind of his alter ego. The whole story is by Baudelaire, and when he went through the time slip, he went through with a vehicle, and part of that vehicle was what we would call a tape recorder. Aldiss calls it something else in the 70s. And Joe is basically recording his experiences and his events as he goes. So it's a very rich book. I'm going to read a tiny little bit from the top of page 92. My senses strained again. Again, the cockerel, its cry a reminder to me, like the little cake that Proust dipped in his tea. What? I know who Proust is. I didn't know he dipped cakes in tea. Did you know that Proust dipped cakes in tea? Today, we have the internet, so we can Google that. 73, no internet, no Google, forget it. And this whole book was like this the first time I read it too. It's had so many references, and I was such a young reader and had so little experience with Proust, for example, that a lot of this just washed over me. I enjoyed it anyway. So, like the little cake that Proust dipped in his tea, that time is a complex thing, stronger than any tide, yet so fragile it can be traversed instantaneously on a familiar sound or smell. Had another time slip occurred? There was something wrong. I sat up, huddling my blanket to my chest. Oh my God, how beautiful is the writing in this book. I could just open it up at any point and read a bit for the beauty of it, like poetry. Some poetry, not all of it do I love. So yes, what other themes and things can I say about this book? Heaps. I could talk about this book for hours. I totally understand why it isn't for everyone. First of all, you've got the letter writing epistolary framing thingy. Not for everyone. Even my favourite books that do that, it's a style that I approach with caution. The narrative wanders and often doesn't seem to have a point. If that bothers you, this book may not be for you. Often you won't know what's happening, and if that bothers you, book not for you. I saw a lot of Goodreads people who really didn't understand where he was aiming for, and I'm not sure that Aldiss himself knew where he was aiming for. There's a lot of debate. So Joe compares his era with all the nuclear explosions and how they've affected the nature of time with Frankenstein in the past, who is doing all these experiments and messing with nature. He talks about the part of humankind that wants to meddle with nature and the hubris of changing things that maybe shouldn't be changed. So there's a fair bit of comparison of those. He goes from being an atheist in the beginning through meeting Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft and Percy Shelley, who were notoriously atheist, scientific, and against the mythological way of thinking associated with the Christianity of their time. By the end, though, Joe is calling down God a lot. So you've got that mysticism versus science versus inner luminosity, I suppose, as an ongoing theme throughout the book. I didn't always love that, but I did respect it. And it too harks back to Frankenstein, where the monster starts off as unknowing, but he finds his own identity through reading Milton's Paradise Lost, which I've also read. I don't think that's a good place to get your spirituality from. However, Mary Shelley used that to great effect to create the monster as an actual more complete moral thinking being than his creator Baron Frankenstein, and that comes through here as well. Joe likes Frankenstein himself less and less, and he makes choices that I think are sometimes odd for not liking Frankenstein. He seems to follow in his footsteps to an extent that's odd. There's also in this book no point does it actually go into a discussion of how Shelley, Percy Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft, Byron, all real people in a real place that we can identify with in the past, and then he visits them. Mary has got no knowledge of Baron Frankenstein or the events that are occurring just slightly down the lane, and which our protagonist Joe has already seen. But all of those protagonists in that book are fiction. So there's never any discussion or completion that you get from this fiction versus fact versus past. And some people, I think, got upset by that as well. What else can we say? The science in this, I first started off thinking, because the science of the time slip is no more than mentioning that uranium disordered nature. In fact, Aldiss was echoing Frankenstein, where the science of creating the monster is never described beyond galvanic action. Yes. So that's how I first thought of it. I thought that Aldiss was echoing the Frankenstein lack of science to describe what's happening. But later on, he actually goes into considerably more scientific detail as for how Baron Frankenstein is creating his second monster. He goes into far more detail than Mary ever could. I don't think that information was available to her. And Aldiss actually mentions that. But I love the way that he's gone into the science of the times and what would have been available to Baron Frankenstein to create a more complete science picture for us, the modern reader. So I love that. What else? There's so much. There's descriptions of Switzerland, which I so much loved. At some point, our protagonist ends up in a Geneva jail, and then another time slip occurs, which takes away the whole Geneva Lake, which that's some superb writing. I love that. Okay, so, moral of the story. I don't disagree with anyone who gave this book 2 or 3 stars out of 5. I see your point. I know where you're coming from. I perceive the flaws that you felt with it. But overall, I really love this book. I am so glad to get my hands on it again. As I read it, I could remember reading it in the past. And I kind of knew what was in it already. But the experience of reading it now, having read so much more of the tribute, though obviously not Proust and his tea and cake. Maybe I need to read more Proust. I don't remember loving Proust last time I tried. Anyway, Frankenstein Unbound, right? I think it's a marvellous book. I'm never letting this one go again, if I can help it. I'm going to reread it often for the beautiful writing, and there are so many thought-provoking things. Not necessarily the narrative. The end is utterly bewildering. I don't know how he got there, and I don't know what he was trying to say, but maybe with future rereads, I can get what he was trying to say with that ending. And the bit before the ending, which I'm not going to tell you because it never happened in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and it's just wild. So much of this never happened in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and is wild. And so many small things did, but you're seeing them from a different perspective. Oh, yes. It's marvellous. This book is marvellous. Frankenstein. On Stephen's suggestion, I'm going to maintain an open mind about that one, but it's tricky. It's tough. So if you've read Frankenstein Unbound, I want to hear. If you loved it, I want to hear, because not too many people apparently did. If you disliked it, I want to hear that too. I'm not going to argue with you probably about that, but I think there's a lot here. I'm very glad to have read this Aldiss book. I think there was another point I wanted to make that I wrote down at some stage, but I have... Oh yes, there's a weird notion in here, and if you have read it, for about 2 or 3 chapters in there, Joe keeps talking about his superior self, and I really never got that. He also undertakes to rescue Justine Moritz, who, as we know, has been wrongly accused of killing Baron Frankenstein's younger brother, William. The monster did that. She is convicted, however. Joe sets off to save her, but then sort of forgets about it and wanders on. What was with that? If you've got answers for the Justine Moritz rescue that never happened because he wandered away, and for the ending, which I don't get, maybe put a spoiler on it if you answer my ending question. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and go away, read good books. Maybe this one, which I'm going to say is a very good book, but maybe other ones if you didn't like it. Thanks for watching. Bye.